Robert Sean Leonard reads Tim Gautreaux's The Piano Tuner.
The phone rang Monday morning while the piano tuner was shaving and he nicked himself. The strange lady was on the line. The one who hardly ever came out of her big house, stuck back in the cane field south of town. The piano tuner told her he'd come out, and then he wiped the receiver free of shaving cream and blood. Back at the lavatory, he went after his white whiskers, remembering that she was a fairly good-looking woman, quite a bit younger than he was, mid-30s. She also had a little money, and the piano tuner, whose name was Claude, wondered why she didn't try to lose some of it at the Indian casino, or at least spend a bit cheering herself up with a bowl of gumbo at Babinot's Cafe. He knew that all she did was sit in a 150-year-old house and practice pop tunes on a moth-eaten George Steck upright. Claude gathered his tuning kit, drank coffee with his wife, then headed out into the country in his little white van. He made a dozen turns and got on the clamshell road that ran by Michel Placervent's unpainted house, a squared-off antique thing set high up on crumbling brick pillars. Behind the house were gray wood outbuildings, and behind those the sugar cane grew taller than a man and spread for miles, level as a giant's lawn. As he pulled his toolkit out of the van, Claude recalled that Michel was the end of the line for the Placervents, Creole planters who always had just enough money and influence to make themselves disliked in a poor community. Her mother had died 10 years before, after Michel had graduated with a music degree and come home to take care of her. He looked up on the gallery, stopping a moment to remember her father, a pale, overweight man with oiled hair who would sit in a rocker and yell after cars speeding in the dusty road as though he could control the world with a mean word. The piano tuner remembered that Mr. Placervent had begun to step up his drinking after his wife died, and Michel had to tend him like a baby, until he dropped dead in the yard yelling at a postman about receiving too many advertisements from Kmart. From that point on, it was just her. The black housekeeper, the home place, and the 1,000 acres the bank managed for her. Then the housekeeper died. It had been a year since she had called him for a tuning. He stopped under a crepe myrtle growing up by the porch, noticing that the yard hadn't been cut in a month and the spears of grass were turning to seed. The porch was sagging like a long frown, and the 12 steps that led to it bounced like a trampoline as he went up. He knocked and Michel turned the knob and backed away, waving him in with a faint hand motion and a small smile, the way Placervents had been doing for 200 years to people not as good as they were. But Claude didn't hold it against her because he knew how she had been raised. Michel reminded him of one of those pastries inside the display case down at Dufresne's Bakery. Pretty, but when you tried to handle them, they fell apart and your fingers went through to the goo inside. She was bouncing on the balls of her feet as if she expected she might float off at any minute. He saw that she'd put on a few pounds and wasn't carrying her shoulders well, but also that there was still a graceful and old-timey shape to her hips and breasts. Her hair was dark and curly, and her eyes were the brown of worn sharps on an old upright. A man could take an interest in her, as long as he didn't look in those eyes, the piano tuner thought. He glanced around the house and saw it was falling apart. "I'm glad you could come out so soon," she said. "Sea above middle sea is stuck." She pointed to an ornate, walnut-cased vertigrand, and he remembered its rusty harp and dull, hymning soundbird. It would take 3 hours to get it regulated and pulled back to pitch. He saw an antique plush chair, faded, with the imprint of her seat in its velvet, and he knew she would sit there until he was finished. Claude usually talked while he did regulation, so he chatted as he unscrewed the fall board, pulled up the front, and flopped back the lid. After a little while, he found an oval pill wedged between 2 keys and fished it out with a string mute. When she saw what it was, she blushed. "Is this one of yours?" he asked, putting it on a side table. Her eyes followed his hand. You remember Clotilde? He nodded. She sure could cook, I heard. She called it a happy pill. She told me that if things got too much for me to handle, I could take it. She glanced up as though she'd told a secret by accident, and her eyes grew round. I never took it because it's the only one. Claude stole a look at her where she sat, in front of the buckled plaster wall and its yellowed photographs of dead placervents. It occurred to him that Michelle had never done anything, never worked, except at maintaining her helpless mother and snarling old man. He remembered seeing her in town, always in stores, sometimes looking half dead and pale, sometimes talking a mile a minute, as he brought food, medicines for the aged, adult diapers, coming in quick, going out the same way, enveloped in a cloud of jasmine perfume. You know, he said, you could probably go to a doctor and get another pill or two. She waved him off with 2 fingers. I can't stand to go to doctors. Their waiting rooms make me want to pass out. There, he said, running a trill on the freed ivory. One problem solved already. It's good to get rid of at least one, she said, folding her hands in her lap and leaning forward from the waist. What problems you having, Michelle? He put a tuning hammer onto a pin and struck a fork for A. His tuning machine was being repaired, the factory, so he'd gone back to listening, setting temperament by ear. Why, none at all? She said, too brightly and breathlessly. Claude thought she spoke like an actress in a 1940s movie, an artificial flower like Loretta Young, who couldn't fish a pill from between 2 piano keys to save her soul. He struck the butt of the fork on the upturned lid and tuned A440, then the A's above and below that, and set perfect reference notes in between, tuning by fifths, flattening strings until the sounds in the steel wires matched the sounds in his head. He then tuned by octaves from the reference notes, and this took over an hour. Michelle sat there with her pale hands in her lap, as though she had bought a ticket to watch. The piano's hammers were hard, so he gave them a quick grind with his moto tool and massaged the dampers, which were starting to buzz when they fell against the strings. He went over the tuning pins again. I don't know if this job will hold perfect pitch, Michelle, but if a note or two falls back, give me a call and I'll swing by. She nodded. Whenever you're out this way, you can stop in. If something's wrong with the piano, I'll be glad to pay to get it fixed. She smiled a little too widely, like someone desperate to have company, which the tuner guessed she was. He sat down to play a little tune he tested instruments with, but then stopped after half a minute. What the tuner remembered was that he'd never heard Michelle play. Judging from the wear on the hammers, she must have practiced all the time, so he asked her. She stood, fluffed her skirt, and walked over with a goosey step. Claude expected she might ring the notes out, more or less in time, the way most players do. But after 10 minutes of As Time Goes By, he could hear that she had a great natural touch, making old George lay the hammers against the strings like big felt teardrops, building note words that belled out into the room. The piano tuner was moved by what she was doing with his work. Next, she surprised him by playing something that sounded like Mozart. Claude had hung around kiddie recitals enough to know a little about classical music, though he'd seldom heard it out here in the cane fields. He watched her long fingers roll and dart. And when she began to play a slow, fingertippy introduction to Stardust, he had to sit down. He'd heard the song played by everybody and their pet dog, but her touch was something else, like Nat King Cole's voice made from piano notes. Echoey and dusty. She used the old bass sustain pedal to milk the overtones out of the new tuning job. Claude closed his eyes and saw the notes floating slowly around the room. The piano tuner was the kind of person who hated for anything to go to waste and thought the saddest thing in the world was a fine instrument that nobody ever touched. So it made him uneasy that someone who could play like this lived alone and depressed in an antique nightmare of a house 10 miles from the nearest ear that knew what the hell her fingers were doing. And when she finished, he asked her how she spent her time. She folded her music and glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. Since my father's gone, there's not much to do, she said, turning on the bench to face him. Sometimes the different people who lease the land come by to talk. I have television." She motioned to a floor cabinet model topped by an elaborate set of rabbit ears. "Lord, why don't you get a satellite dish?" She turned over a hand in her lap. "I really don't watch anything. It just keeps me company when I can't sleep at night." She gave him a kind of goofy, apologetic smile. He began to set his tuning forks in their felt pockets. "As good as you play, you ought to get a decent piano." The corners of her mouth came down a bit. "I tried to get Lanyo's music to bring out a new upright, but they said the old steps wouldn't hold a piano and moving crew." She placed an upturned hand on George's yellowed teeth. "They told me they'd never get this thing off the porch. We're 7 feet above the ground here." "You can't take it out the back?" "The steps are worse there, rotted through." She let the fall board drop over the ivories with a bang. "If I could get a new instrument, I'd push this out the back door and let it fall into the yard for the scrap man." She passed a hand quickly above her dark hair as though waving off a wasp. He looked up at the rain-splotched plaster. "You ever thought about moving?" "Every day. I can't afford to. And anyway, the house, I guess it's like family." Claude picked up a screwdriver. "You ought to get out more. A woman your age needs..." He started to say she needed a boyfriend, but then he looked around at the rotting curtains, the 12-foot ceilings lined with dusty plaster molding, and then back at her trembly shoulders, realizing that she was so out of touch and rusty at life that the only man she should see was a psychiatrist. So then he said, "A job," just because he had to finish the sentence. "Oh," she said, as though on the edge of crying. "Hey, it's not so bad. I work every day and I'm too busy to get blue." She looked at his little box of mutes and felts. "I can't think of a thing I know how to do," she said. At supper, Claude's wife was home from her little hole-in-the-wall insurance office, and he asked her if she knew Michelle Placervent. "We don't carry her," she said, going after a plate of red beans and rice and reading a pamphlet on term life. "That's not what I asked you." She looked up, and the light caught in her bottle-brown hair. "Is she still living out in that little haunted castle?" "Yeah, the whole place shakes just when you walk through it." "Why'd they build it on such tall piers? Did the water get that high before they built the levees?" "It beats me. But do you ever hear anything about her?" He handed her the hot sauce and watched her think. "I heard she was depressed as hell, I can tell you that. Bonnie LeBlanc said she had a panic attack in his restaurant and had to leave just as the waitress brought her shrimp etouffee." Yvette shook her head, "And Bonnie makes dynamite etouffee." "She can play the hell out of a piano," he said. "Seems like I heard that." Yvette turned the page on her pamphlet. "Sings, too. She needs to get a job." "Well, she knows how to drive a tractor." "What?" "I heard that her father forced her to learn when she was just a kid. I don't know why. Maybe he was mad she wasn't born a boy." Yvette took a long drink of iced tea. "I heard if a field hand left a tractor by the gate and a rain was coming up, he'd send Michelle out to bring it under the shed. Wouldn't even let her change out of her dress, just made her climb up on that greasy thing and go." "Damn. I wouldn't have thought she could operate a doorbell," Claude said. His wife cut her eyes over to him. "It might surprise you what some people can do," she told him. 2 weeks later, Claude was sitting in his recliner, his mind empty except for a football game playing in it, when the phone rang. It was Michelle Placervent. And her voice struck his ear like the plea of a drowning sailor. She was crying into the receiver about how 3 notes on her keyboard had soured and another key was stuck. The more she explained what was wrong with her piano, the more she cried, until she began weeping. Claude thought as if her whole family had died in a plane crash, aunts and cousins and canaries. He interrupted. "Michelle, it's only a piano. Next time I'm out your way, I'll check it. Maybe Monday sometime?" "No," she cried. "I need someone to come out here now." Uh-oh, he thought. He hung up and went to find his wife. Yvette was at the sink peeling onions, and he told her about Michelle. She banged a piece of onion skin off her knife. "You better go fix her piano." she said, "if that's what needs fixing." She looked at the piano tuner's gray hair as though she might be wondering if Michel Placervant found him attractive. "Do you want to come along for the ride?" he said. She shook her head and kissed him on the chin. "I've got to finish supper. When Chad gets home from football practice, he'll be starving." She picked up another onion and cut off the green shoots, her eyes flicking up at him. "If she's real sick, call Dr. Meltier." Claude drove out there as quickly as he could, sorry he'd ever tuned the worn-out piano in the first place. Giving a good musician a fine tuning is always a risk because when the first string starts to vibrate, he gets dissatisfied and calls up, as if one little note that's off, just a bit off, ruins the whole song. She was dressed in faded stretch jeans and a green sweatshirt, and her hair was unbrushed and oily. The house was as uncombed as she was. Claude looked at her trembly fingers and her wild eyes and asked if she had any relatives or friends in town. "Everybody is dead or moved far away," she told him, her eyes streaming and her face red and sticky. He watched her, feeling suddenly tired and helpless. He tried to think what Yvette would do for her. And then he went into the kitchen to make her some hot tea. The cabinets looked as though someone had thrown the pots into them from across the room. The stove was a first-generation gas range that should have been in the museum, and it was listing, the floor sagging under it. The icebox was full of TV dinners, and the pantry showed a few cans of Vienna sausage and beanie weenies. Claude realized that he would be depressed himself if that was all he had to eat. When he brought the tea, she was in the wing chair, leaning to one side, her shoulders rounded in. Sitting on the bench, he carefully checked the keyboard by unisons and fifths, and he found nothing out of pitch, no stuck key. At that moment, he knew that when he turned around, he would have two choices: to say that there was nothing wrong, get in his van, go on with his life, or deal with her. He inspected the alligatored finish on the George Stex case for a long time, examining the sharps for lateral play. Even while he was turning on the satiny bench, he didn't know what he was going to say. Then he saw her eyes, big with dread of something, like a diagnosis. Claude felt as though he were slipping off into quicksand when he opened his mouth. "Michel, who's your doctor?" Her eyes went to the dark, wax-caked floor. "I'm not going." "You got to. Look at yourself. You're sadder than a blind man at a strip show." I just need a little time to adjust. My father's been gone only 6 months." She put a hand on her forehead and hid her eyes from him. "You need a little something, all right, but it ain't time. You've got too much time on your hands." Then he told her what her doctor could do for her, that her depression was just a chemical thing. She could be straightened up with some medicine, he told her. He said many things off the top of his head. And he convinced her to make an appointment with Dr. Meltier. He talked with her a long time in her cold living room. When a thunderbolt hit, storm blew in from the west, he helped her put pots out, catch leaks. He held her hand at the door and got her calm so she wouldn't call him out of his warm bed in a few hours, telling him that the piano had gone up in pitch or was playing itself. A month or so passed. Claude was cutting grass when suddenly he saw Michelle's old black Lincoln charge up the drive, and she got out, smiling too widely, wearing a navy cotton dress that was baggy and wrinkled. He asked her to come in for coffee, and he listened to her talk and talk. The doctor had given her medications to test for a couple of months, and her eyes were bright. In fact, her eyes showed so much happiness they scared him. She asked if he could help her find a job playing the piano. "When you're ready, I'll help." For years, Claude had tuned pianos for places that used lounge pianists, and he knew all the managers. She put 4 spoons of sugar in her coffee with steady hands. "I'm ready right this minute," she said. "I've got to make my music go to work for me." The piano tuner laughed at that, thinking the poor thing was so cheery and upbeat he should call Sid Fontenay, who managed the lounge in that big new motel over in Lafayette. "Sid's always trying out pianists," he told her. "I'll give him a call for you." When he got off the phone, she asked, "How do you play in a lounge?" Claude tried to keep his face from screwing up. "There's nothing to it," he said, sitting down. "You just know 1,000 show tunes and ballads." She nodded. "Okay, I play requests. I play what they ask me to." She adjusted a thin watch band and then looked him in the eye. Claude got up and put their cups in the sink. Sid asked me if you can sing. You don't have to, but he said it would help. You get a lot of requests for old stuff in a classy motel lounge. I was in good voice, she said, clasping her hands until they went white. And then he thought he saw a weakening of the mood flash through her eyes, a little electrical thrill of fright. How do I dress? He lathered up a dishcloth and looked over at her hair, which was short, coffee brown. He regarded the white skin of her face, the crow's feet, the dryness. Why don't you go to Sears and buy a black dress and some fake pearls? Get a little makeup while you're at it. You'll be the best-looking thing in the lounge. Sid says he'll try you tomorrow night in the bar at 9 o'clock. It's the big new motel on the interstate. Claude's wife had often told him that he invented reality by saying it. And he was thinking this as he talked to the medicated, hermit-like woman seated in his kitchen. He was also thinking that the last place on earth he would want to be was in the piano bar of a Lafayette motel at 9 at night, and naturally, the next question to come out between Michel Plassenbert's straight teeth was, "Can't you please come with me this first time?" Claude took a breath and said, "I'd be glad to." And she clapped her hands like an organ grinder's monkey. He wondered what she was taking and how much of it. He almost convinced Yvette to come along with him, but their 17-year-old boy came down with the flu and she stayed home to nurse. She made her husband wear a sport coat, but he refused to put on a tie. "You want to look good for your date?" she told him with a smirk. "Get out of here." He turned red in the face and walked onto the porch to wait in the night air. Michelle picked him up, and he had to admit that she looked blue blood sharp. He imagined she must have bought a girdle along with her velvety black dress. On the way to Lafayette, the Lincoln drifted above the narrow, flat highway through the sugar cane, and Claude got her to talk about herself. She told him that she had been engaged twice, but old man Placer went so nasty to the young men, he just ran them off. Her grandfather had wanted to tear the old house down from bats to termites, build a new place, but her father wouldn't hear of it. She said he'd worn the building like a badge, some proof that he was better than anyone else. The only proof, Michelle said, and now I'm trapped in it. The piano tuner didn't know what to say other than that she could look forward to hurricane season, but he kept his mouth closed. The lounge was a long room, glass walls on one side and a long bar with a smiling lady bartender on the other. He introduced Michelle to Sid, a bright-looking man, savvy, dressed in an expensive suit. Sid smiled at her and pointed out the piano, and the next thing Claude knew, Michelle was seated behind a rebuilt satin black Steinway playing Put on a Happy Face, her high-heeled foot holding down the soft pedal. After a while, the room began to fill with local oil men and their glitzy women, plus the usual salesmen sprawling at the tables, and even a couple of cowboys who lit like dragonflies at the bar. A slim, tipsy woman in tight white jeans and spike heels approached the piano and made a request, putting a bill into the glass on the lid. Michelle stared at the money for a moment and started Yesterday, playing for 6 minutes. Claude sat at a tiny table next to the window overlooking the swimming pool and ordered a German beer. He'd never done anything like this. He felt out of place. When he did frequent a bar, it was the kind of place with Cajun music on the jukebox and a gallon jar of pig's feet on the counter. Michelle finished the tune and looked over at him, and he gave her the okay sign. She smiled and sailed into another, then tickled off a half dozen more over the next 45 minutes. At one point, she walked to Claude's table to ask how she was doing. He could see, even in the dim light, that her eyes were too intense. The way a person's eyes get when she's having too much fun. A piano tuner wanted to say, lighten up on the arpeggios. Slow your tempo. But she was floating before him as fragile as a soap bubble. So he gave her the thumbs up. Perfect. Sid says you can have $100 for 4 hours plus tips. Money, she squealed, bouncing back to the piano and starting the Pennsylvania polka, playing with a lot of sustain pedal. A brace of oil men looked over briefly, but most people just leaned closer to talk or patted their feet. Claude signaled her to quiet it down a bit. For an hour and a half, he watched as Michelle played and grinned at people coming to her tip glass. She sang one song through the microphone over her keyboard and drew a moderate wave of applause. She was a good-looking woman, but she had never learned how to move around people. And Claude got the feeling that folks who studied her close up thought she was a little silly. He sat there wishing there was a regulating button on the back of her head so he could just give it a quarter turn. Eventually, the piano tuner became drowsy and hungry in the dim light of the lounge, so he walked across the lobby to the restaurant and treated himself to a deluxe burger basket and another cold bottle of beer. He sat there next to the plant box full of plastic flowers and worried about Michelle and whether he'd done the right thing by turning a Creole queen into a motel lounge pianist. As soon as he left the restaurant, he could tell something was not exactly right. A young couple walked out of the lounge with quick steps, and then he heard the music. Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. Sid appeared at the lounge entrance and waved him over. "Michelle's really smoking our Steinway," he said, putting his mouth to the piano tuner's ear. "You know, this crowd thinks classical music is something like Floyd Kramer's greatest hits." Claude looked into the room where customers seemed to bend under the shower of notes like cows hiding from a thunderstorm. Some of the loud salesmen had stopped selling mud pumps and chemicals to listen, and the drunk cowboys who had picked up two women were trying to jitterbug. Sid put a hand on Claude's shoulder. "What's going on? She's got to know that's not the right music for this place." "I'll talk to her." He glanced over his shoulder. "She's smiling a lot. Is she on something?" Sid knew musicians. "Depression medication." He sniffed. "Well, I guess that music will drive you off the deep end." After the big rumbling finale, the cowboys let out a rebel yell, but no one applauded. And Claude walked over and put his hand on her back, bending down. "That was good, Michelle." What else could he say to her? She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, her skin flushed from sweating. "You don't fool me. I know what you're thinking." "But I couldn't help it. I just got this surge of anger and had to let it out." "What are you mad at?" He saw that her shoulders were trembling. She didn't say anything at first, and then she looked up at him. "I've been sitting here thinking that I would have to play piano 5 nights a week for 23 years to pay for the renovation of my house." She straightened up and looked over the long piano at the bartender, who had both hands on the bar watching her. "What am I doing here?" She ran a palm down her soft throat. "I'm a placer vent." Claude pushed her microphone aside. "Your medications are maybe a little out of adjustment," he said in a low voice, wishing he was any place on earth other than where he was. He looked over at Sid. "You ought to finish this set." "Why? I can survive without the money. I mean, I appreciate you getting me this job, but I think I'm ready to go home." She seemed angry and out of control, but she didn't move. He was sure his face showed that he was getting upset himself. She stared down at the keys until finally one of the cowboys, really just a French farm boy from down in Cameron Parish, wearing a loud shirt and a Walmart hat, came up and put a 5 in her tip glass. "Hey, lady, can you play any Patsy Cline?" An injured little smile came to her lips. She straightened her back and started to say something to him, but instead she looked at Claude. At his embarrassed and hopeful face, her mouth closed in a line, and her right hand went down to begin picking out an intro. Then, to his amazement, she started to sing, and people looked up as though Patsy Cline had come back. And the whole room got quiet to listen. "Crazy," Michelle sang. Soft as midnight fog outside a bedroom window. Crazy for feeling so lonely. He didn't see her for a long time. At Sid, someone spilled a highball into the Steinway, and when Claude was over there to straighten it out, the manager told him she was still playing on weekends, and off and on at the Sheraton and a little at the country club for the oil company parties. He said that she'd gotten her dosage pretty regulated, and she played well, except toward the end of the night when she would start singing blues numbers and laughing out loud between the verses as though she were telling in her head. Laughing very loudly. The piano tuner wondered if she would ever get on an even keel. People like Michelle, he thought. Sometimes their talent helped them fix themselves, sometimes not. Nobody could predict. In the middle of December, she called him to come tune a new console she'd bought. She'd finally gotten a carpenter to put knee braces under the front steps so Lanniau's music could bring a piano into the house. They told her they didn't want George as a trade-in, though, and that they wouldn't take the big vertigrand down into the yard for $1 million. It was built like a wooden warship with 7 5x5 back braces, and it weighed nearly 800 pounds. When Claude got there, the entry was open, the dark giant of a piano at the head of the long hall that led to the back porch. As he stepped in, he saw the new piano in the parlor, a cheap, ugly blonde wood model. He couldn't believe she'd chosen it. Michelle appeared at the far end of the hall looking wild-eyed, her hair falling in loose, dangly ringlets. She was wearing rust-smeared tan slacks under a yellow rain slicker and was lugging the end of a half-inch cable in her cotton gardening gloves. "Claude," she said, shaking her head, "you wouldn't believe the trouble I've had this morning. I had Lanniau's crew push the old piano into the hall, but the rollers on the bottom locked up. Just look what they did to the floor." She swept a hand low. The floors were so covered with 200-year-old divots brimming with cloudy wax that he couldn't spot any new damage. They managed to get it up on this old braided rug, and I figured I could tow it off the back porch and let it fall into the yard. He looked in her eyes to see what was going on. "You're going to skid this thing down the hardwood on this rug? We can't just push it ourselves?" "Give it a try." He leaned on it. He was a small man, and the piano didn't budge. "I see what you mean." He looked down the hall to the open rear door. "You think it'll slide onto the porch and fall through the back steps? They have to be replaced anyway. Mr. Arsimont said that he would cart away the mess next week." She ran the cable under the keyboard and around the back through the handholds, completing the loop and setting the hook. When she passed by the piano tuner, he smelled gasoline on her clothes. And he walked to the back door to see what she'd hooked the cable to. Idling away in the yard was a John Deere 720, a big 2-cylinder tractor running on propane. God almighty, Michelle. That tractor's the size of a locomotive. "It's the only one in the barn that would start," she said, dropping the cable slack into the yard. He looked out at the rust-roofed outbuildings, their gray cypress darkening in the drizzle. She began picking her way down the porous steps, which didn't look like they'd support his weight, so he went out the front door and walked around to the back. He found Michelle standing on the right axle housing of the tractor, facing backward, looking into the hall at the piano. The machine's exhaust was thudding like a bass drum. He remembered that older John Deeres have a long clutch lever instead of a foot pedal, and she was easing this out to take up the slack in the cable. A tire rolled up on the septic tank's lid, and the front end veered sharply. Claude didn't know exactly what she was trying to do, but he offered to help. "I've planned this through. You stay on that ground and watch." She sat in the seat, found reverse gear, backed the tractor closer to the house, snugged the steering wheel with a rubber tie-down so it wouldn't wander again, then eased forward in the lowest gear until the cable was taut. With the slack out of the line, she put the lever all the way forward, and the machine began to crawl. Claude walked way out in the yard, stood on tiptoe, and saw George skidding down the hall, wandering from side to side, but looking as though it would indeed bump out of the house and into the back porch. About 3 feet from the door, the piano rolled off the rug and started to turn broadside to the entryway. Now, Michelle stopped the tractor and yelled something. He couldn't understand it over the engine noise, but she might have been asking him to go inside and straighten the piano. She stepped out onto the axle again, leaning forward to jump to the ground, and the piano tuner held his breath because there was something wrong with the way she was getting off. Her rain slicker caught on the long lever, and he heard the clutch pop as it engaged. Michelle fell to her stomach, the big tractor moving above her. Claude ran over, and when she came out from under the drawbar, he grabbed her arm, got her up. Meanwhile, the tractor had pulled the piano's soundboard flat against the entryway to the house, where it jammed for about half a second. The tractor gasped as its governor opened up and dumped gas in its engine, and chuck, chuck, the exhaust exploded, the big tires squatted, bit into the lawn, and the piano came out with the back wall of the entire house. 3 rows of brick piers collapsing like stacks of dominoes. The kitchen, rear bedroom, and back porch disintegrating in a tornado of plaster dust and cracking, wailing boards. A musical waterfall of slate shingles ratted down from the roof. The whole house trembled. Nearly every window pane tinkled out. And just when Claude and Michel thought things had stopped collapsing, the hall fell in, all the way to the front door, which swung closed with a bang. The tractor kept puttering away toward the north at around 4 miles an hour, and the piano tuner wondered if he should run after it. Michelle began to make a whining noise deep in her throat. She hung on to him and started to swing as if she'd pass out. He couldn't think of a word to say, and they stared at the wreck of a house as though considering putting it back together with airplane glue, when a big yellow jet of gas flamed up from about where the stove would be in all the rubble. "A fire," she said breathlessly, tears welling up in her eyes. "Where's the closest neighbor?" he asked, feeling at least now he could do something. "The Arsements, about a mile off." Her voice was tiny and broken as she pointed a thin white arm to the east. So he gathered her up and walked her to the front, putting her in his van and tearing down the blacktop toward the nearest working telephone. By the time the Grand Gautreaux volunteer fire department got out to Michel Placenvert's place, the house was one big orange star, burning so hot that it made little smoke. The firemen ran up to the fence but lost heart right there. They began spraying the camellias at roadside and the live oaks farther in. Claude had rescued Michel's Lincoln before the paint blistered off, and she sat in it on the side of the road looking like a World War II refugee he had seen on the History Channel. Minos LeBlanc, the fire chief, talked to her for a while and asked if she had insurance. She nodded. The only good thing the house had was insurance. She put her hands up, her face into them, and Claude and Minos looked away, expecting the crying to come. But it didn't. She asked for a cup of water, and the piano tuner watched her wash down a pill. After a while, she locked her Lincoln and asked him to take her into town. "I have an acquaintance I can stay with, but she won't come home from work until 5:30. She ran her eyes up a bare chimney rising out of the great fire. "All these years, and only one person who'll put me up. Ha! Come on home and eat supper with us," he said. "No." She looked down at her dirty slacks. "I wouldn't want your wife to see me like this." She seemed almost frightened, looked around him at the firemen. "Don't worry about that. She'll be glad to loan you some clothes to get you through the night." He placed himself between her and the fire. She ran her white fingers through her curls and nodded. "All right." But she watched him out of the corner of her eye all the way into town as though she didn't trust him to take her to the right place. About a block before Claude turned down his street, she let out a giggle, and he figured her chemicals were starting to take effect. Yvette showed her the phone, and she called several people, then came into the living room where Claude was watching TV. "I can go to my friend Miriam's after 6:30, she said, settling slowly into the sofa, her head toward the television. "I'll take you over right after we eat." He shook his head and looked at the rust and mud on her knees. "Gosh, I am sorry for you." She kept watching the screen. "Look at me. I'm homeless." But she was not frowning. When the 6 o'clock news came on Channel 10, the fifth story was about a large green tractor that had just come out of a cane field at the edge of Billotville, dragging the muddy hulk of a piano on a long cable. The announcer explained how the tractor plowed through a woman's yard and proceeded up La Monica Street toward uptown, where it climbed a curb and began to struggle up the steps of St. Martin's Catholic Church, until Rosalie Landry, a member of the Ladies' Altar Society who was sweeping out the vestibule, stopped the machine by knocking off the tractor's spark plug wires with the handle of her broom. As of 5:30, Vermilion Parish Sheriff's deputies did not know where the tractor had come from or who owned it and the battered piano. Claude stood straight up. I can't believe it didn't stall out somewhere. Billardville's 4 miles from your house. Michelle began laughing, quietly at first, her shoulders jiggling as she tried to hold it in. Then she opened her mouth and let out a big sailing laugh and kept it going, soaring up into shrieks and gales, some kind of tears rolling on her face. Yvette came to the door holding a big spoon, looked at her husband and shook her head. He reached over and grabbed Michelle's arm. Are you all right? She tried to talk between seizures of laughter. Can't you see, she keened, it escaped. On the television, a priest was shaking his head at the steaming tractor. She started laughing again, and this time Claude could see halfway down her throat. A year later, he was called out for 4 tunings in Lafayette on one day. September was like that for him with the start of school and piano lessons. On top of it all, Sid called to fish out a bottle of bar nuts and a lounge piano. He got there late. Sid brought him supper in the restaurant before he started work. The manager wore his usual dark gray silk suit, and his black hair was combed straight back. Your friend, he said, as if the word friend had a particularly rich meaning for them, is still working here, you know. Yeah, I was over at her apartment last month, tuning a new console for her. Claude shoveled up pieces of hamburger steak. You know, there's even some strange folks that come in as regulars just to hear her. Claude looked up at him. She's a good musician, a nice woman, he said between chews. Sid took another slow drink, setting the glass down carefully. She looks nice, he said, emphasizing the word looks. The piano tuner recognized that this is how Sid talked, not explaining, just using his voice to hint at things. The manager leaned into him, but sometimes she starts speaking right in the middle of a song. Strange things. He looked at his watch. She's starting early tonight for a convention crowd, a bunch of 4-eyed English teachers. What time? About 8. He took a drink and looked at the piano tuner. Every night I hold my breath. That evening, the room was cool and polished. A new little dance floor had been laid down next to the piano, and Michelle showed up wearing round metal frame glasses and a black velvet dress. The piano was turned broadside to the room so that everyone could watch her hands. She started playing immediately. A nice old foxtrot Claude had forgotten the name of. Then she played a hymn, then a ragtime number. He sat there enjoying the bell quality of his own tuning job. Between songs, she spotted him, and her eyes ballooned. She threw her long arms up and yelled into the microphone, Hey, everybody! I see Claude from Grand Crapeau, the best piano tuner in the business. Let's give Claude a round of applause. A spatter of clapping came from the bar. Claude gave her a worried glance, and she made herself calm. She put her hands in her lap, waited for the applause to stop. Then she set out a heavy book of music on the rack. Her fingers uncurled into their ivory arches, and she began a slow Scott Joplin number with a hidden tango beat, playing it so that the sad notes bloomed like flowers. Claude remembered the title, Solace. Did you know, she asked the room over her microphone during the music, that Scott Joplin played piano in a whorehouse for a little while? Claude looked out at all the assembled English teachers, at the glint of eyeglasses and name tags and upturned, surprised faces. He understood that Michelle could never adjust to being an entertainer. But at least she was brave. Yes, she continued, they say he died crazy with syphilis. On April Fool's Day, 1917. She nodded toward the thick music book, all rags, marches and waltzes. 1 penicillin shot might have brought us another 100 melodies. she told the room. That's kind of funny and sad at the same time, isn't it? She pulled back from the microphone, polishing the troubling notes. Claude listened and felt the hair rise on his arms. When she finished, he waved at her, then got up and walked toward the lobby, where he stood for a moment, watching the ordinary people. He heard her start up a show tune, and he turned and looked back into the lounge as three couples rose in unison to dance.